Hi everyone, welcome to THT, and today we have an exciting videos where we got the first spoilers for Jump to Lightspeed, which is going to be set 4 for Star Wars Unlimited. So this is going to be our spoiler analysis part 1. Once again, these are first impressions. I haven't played with any of those cards, so obviously my opinion on this has to be taken with a grain of salt, and of course it's also very early on in the spoiler season, where we don't know, we don't have the full pictures of what those different archetypes entails, which obviously can vastly impact the power level of certain cards. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. It is just a first impression whether I think those cards are good or not in this first impression. Also going to give a couple of comments on those new mechanics that we have. And without further ado, let's get into it. So if you like that kind of video, please like and subscribe. And here's the 4 different ways I like to rate things. The first one is not exciting. I think the card is either bad or very niche. So it doesn't necessarily mean that I think the card is unplayable, but it means that if this card ever sees plays, it's going to be extremely niche. Next one is like simply the one I'm not sure the card has potential, but we need to see the rest of the set or see how the meta is going to shape up to see if the card is going to be any good. Next one is a card that I'm relatively confident the card is going to be good and is going to see some competitive play. And finally, we have the amazing card, which is a card that I think is going to be very strong and could have some major impact on the meta. As you know, I rate cards relatively tough in terms of some people say I rate cards very harshly, but to be fair, Twilight of the Republic overall has been a very weak set. And most of the ratings I put on Twilight Republic were justified, and in a lot of cases I actually overrated some of the cards. And as we're getting more and more sets, my rating has to be harsher and harsher, because obviously the environment in which those cards are going to come in is a more competitive environment where there's simply just a lot more cards that those things are competing with, which means that over time there's going to be less and less of those sets going to see play. With all that being said, my hopes for this set 3, I'm really hoping that this set 4 is going to bring some cards that are really much more powerful than what we had. I'm really hoping for a set that is going to really shake the meta in a significant way and is going to have much more impact than set 3 had. So this is really kind of my hopes for this upcoming set. I also have to talk about a little bit about the theme of the set. The theme is going to be kind of space units, space stuff on the original trilogy, which is by far my favorite theme for Star Wars. My favorite part about Star Wars is the space stuff, is the Star Wars. I'm not really that big on the Jedi and stuff. I much prefer spaceships and all that stuff. Is kind of like what I prefer. This was I'm a big fan of game like Star Wars Armada. And obviously the original trilogy is my favorite one, so this is basically the set that's been made for me from a thematic standpoint. So I'm really excited about it. Moving on to our first card is obviously the new leaders Boba Fett. Yet another Boba Fett leader. This is already our 3rd Boba Fett leader, which is absolutely insane. I think this is like a little crazy. Like, we're talking about a background characters in the original trilogy that has like 2 lines of text and get killed by mistake. So it's like, I found it a little bit crazy. I understand there's a huge fanboys around Boba Fett and stuff, but I think it's a little bit exaggerated here. Already a 3rd Boba Fett leader. Anyway, so if anybody had doubts, where like a lot of people were saying, oh yeah, if Boba Fett gets banned, people won't have a chance to be playing Boba Fett as a leader anymore. Well, we already have another Boba Fett heroism. Now we get another Boba Fett on the villainy side. So yeah, Fett's Fire Spray still is gonna have plenty of good days. Keep in mind that yeah, you can also play, of course, Boba Fett's armor on Boba Fett like that. So it's like pretty. Boba Fett still has plenty of great time ahead of him. So let's talk about this Boba Fett leader. So this Boba Fett has, the first thing is say, like, he has this new mechanic, like the upgrade, where he gets to upgrade as a leader, where he can be played as an upgrade on something, and this will give you like immediate impact, where you deal 4 damage divided as long as you choose, and +4/+4. So the leader unit. The leader side is extremely weak. So what he does, like, it deals, every time you deal non-combat damage to something, you deal 1 indirect damage to a player. And the player, which means the opponent, gets to choose where this damage is going to go, whether it goes on the base or whether it goes on one of the units. And that is very, very weak, because what happens is that every time there's an effect in the game that gives the opponent the choice on what to do with it, it's always going to choose the worst option for you. So cards like this, no matter how pushed they are usually always very weak. We've seen this with I Am Your Father, we've seen this with Let the Wookiee Win, we've seen this with even the new card, I forgot the name. You pay 1 and you have the choice between discarding a random card or give 2 1/1 tokens. All those cards have always been bad. Like, it's just the way it is. They always been bad. Every time you have an effect that makes the opponent chooses what happens, those cards always end up being bad, because you always get to choose the worst option for you. And here's the problem, is that what really makes indirect damage very weak is the fact that the opponent gets to choose its base, which means that the opponent always going to have an option to screw you over no matter what, because if you're playing an aggro deck, you can just direct the damage on useless units. And if you are and if you want to play a control deck, the opponent is just going to put the damage on the base. So no matter what the situation, there's always like a bad scenario for you, which means that this is going to be extremely low impact. Also, 1 damage is really not that much. So it's this ability just in a vacuum is extremely weak. In order to trigger this, you have to deal non-combat damage, so it still remains conditional. You're still gonna have to play specific kind of cards in order to make this work, and also gonna limit the amount of time that you can use the ability, so you can't really abuse it. It's also, you have to exhaust your leaders, so basically the opportunity in which you're gonna have to use the ability are gonna be relatively few betweens. So I think realistically in the game, you if you have a dedicated deck, you might be able to trigger this ability like 4 times in a game. So the leader's ability is, needless to say, incredibly low impact, incredibly weak in my opinion. With that being said, I think where indirect damage is going to start to become more interesting is if you can upgrade those damage to make them so it's you are dealing more damage every time with the indirect damage, or if you can trigger this more often. So maybe so the sheer mass of indirect damage can start to have like a significant impact on the game, because I think this is the kind of strategy, the kind of thing that if you get like very small hints of damage, it really doesn't do much, but if you start ramping up more and more damage, it starts to become more and more powerful. So in a vacuum, I think it's extremely weak, but if there's enough support for it, maybe this could become decent. It's never going to be amazing, but it might just be decent. The much more interesting part of this leader is obviously the leader deploy, as it gets turned into an upgrade. What is very powerful about those leaders upgrade is like, not only does it give like a tremendous amount of stats for free, effectively, because the leader deploy, it also turns the unit into a leader unit, which is huge in terms of impact. I think that if this Linus text was not there, this would be terrible, because the opponent just plays the removal and kills it. But the fact that it turns the unit into a leader means that now the unit is immune to Vanquish, immune to Fail the Dragon, it's immune to Waylay, it's immune to like all sort of things that we know for a fact that leaves us just much more difficult to kill through removals. You're really going to have to play specific removals in order to get rid of this, like for example Rival's Fall, which might become back into trends after this expansion. So this to me is the most important fact. It's like, not only you're giving huge amount of stat boost, which has an immediate impact on the game, granting you are upgrading a unit that's ready, and it also turned that unit to a leader. That is so incredibly relevant. On top of this, you also get an immediate impact with 4 damage among the two, which is fine. It's not amazing. It depends on the situation, I guess. If you manage to deal a couple of damage earlier with the Bobo's ability, then the deploy becomes a bit more impactful. With all that mixed fair, it's a deploy on 6. We know that leaders that deploy on 6, they really need to be substantially stronger than other leaders in order to justify being played. And the fact that it not only has a weak leader ability, and the fact that it deploys late, those two factors combined together is kind of an issue. Other benefits, so as far as like if you deploy just, is just get a 4746, which is pretty bad. 4746 vanilla as a leader deploy is pretty bad, but that's kind of a backup option. Obviously, you are trying to aim to deploy this as a pilot, basically. Couple of notes about the pilots here. The pilots also you can only put like one pilot on upgrade on something, so that's something to bear in mind. Yeah. Another factor as well is that the obviously Boba Fett, of course, it enables fire spray and Boba Fett's armor. Boba Fett's armor on Boba Fett's not super relevant because you won't be able to put the armor on the unit that is upgraded, as far as I know, because it doesn't turn the thing into the Boba Fett. It just is just an upgrade. So you won't be able to put the Boba Fett's armor on the unit that's been upgraded. And the second factor is that obviously, so most of the time you're going to be aiming to play it as an upgrade, in which case the Boba Fett armor becomes irrelevant. So I'm not sure how good the Boba Fett armor is going to be in this Boba Fett deck, but obviously it's going to be amazing with Fire Spray. You can actually play Fire Spray on 6, and on the same turns, upgrade the Fire Spray with +4/+4, turn this Fire Spray into this massive unit that is very hard to kill. So that's pretty damn good. Obviously, there's a massive timing window where your opponent can just kill the Fire Spray, and stuff like this. So there are some very nasty things you can do with this, but those things are very counterable. Something to note about like pilot leaders is that they are easy to counter, because what you can do is you can just make sure there's no space units alive when they deploy, which is not that difficult to do because obviously space units are smaller in size. Also, you can make sure that another thing that is really a hard counter to pilot leaders is like upgrade leaders can be removed with confiscate and fang fighters, which is something that every single deck has access to. So if ever a pilot leader becomes meta, you're going to start seeing confiscates in the sideboard, and just being able to basically kill the opponent leaders for like 1 resource is like such insane value that it's going to be a huge limitation for those leaders. So no matter what happens, I don't think those pilot leaders will absolutely dominate the meta unless they are absolutely insanely pushed, which is not the case for Boba Fett. Because as soon as those guys are going to become meta, people are going to start just putting confiscates in the sideboard, and that's going to really strongly limit the potential. So if I want to summarize, my opinion about Boba Fett is like very strong leader deploy if it's an upgrade, but overall very weak leader's ability, at least from what I know, and also but does have sweet synergies with obviously all the Boba Fett's support cards, which are Fire Sprays and Boba Fett's armor. So there's some good stuff, some bad stuff. Overall, I give this a fry. I give this a maybe because, as I said, just a lot of counters to this kind of strategies, and the leader's ability being so incredibly weak, I think is a very, very big blocker for Boba Fett. Because I think for strong leaders to be strong, you need to have both a good leader's ability and a good leader's deploy. If you're missing one of the two pieces, it's a big deal. Obviously, we have some exceptions. Some card like, for example, Palpatine, which has but even Palpatine has a leader's ability that does get used more and more often nowadays, especially with set 3. So there's that. Moving on, we got another leader, pilot leaders. This is Han Solo. So this is also the third Han Solo leader, but for Han Solo, it's a bit more justified because Han Solo is, after all, a very important character of the Star Wars franchise. So that's a bit more justifiable to have 3 leaders for him. In this case, once again, we got this he deploys on 5, which is a big deal. 3-7 for 5 is definitely a lot better than 4-7 for 6. So as far as just a leader deploy is actually better. And also deploys on 5+3+4 is also quite relevant. Once again, you're still turning that unit into a leader unit, which is huge. And then you get to ready a couple of resources for as many odd cost card that you have. So odd cost is either cost 0, 1. So yeah, 0 is 0 count as odd. Actually, I actually don't know about this, but anyway, that was odd 3. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, etc. In this case, it also counts itself because it's an odd costing upgrade, so it does count itself. So whenever this comes out, you will get to deploy to ready at least 1 resources, but most likely you should be able to ready 2 or 3 resources with this. And I think it's relatively important for any pilots to have some sort of immediate impact, because once again, if they get dealt with the confiscate and stuff, at least you got a little bit of value out of it, even though it is still a massive blowout. So other interesting thing about Han Solo is like he's a rebel, which is a pretty big deal. That means he can be boosted by wing leaders, fleet lieutenants, which are some of the best cards in the game. The only reason why fleet lieutenants and wing leaders have seen less play over time is because we have seen a lesser and lesser amount of rebels. But once again, with this new expansion, I'm expecting to see a lot more rebels, which is going to pull those cards back in the forefront, and Han Solo is already a first good example of a leader rebel that you can deploy relatively early and then boost with wing leaders and buff with fleet lieutenants and stuff, which is pretty great. So I think the leader deploy is very strong. +3/+4 for 5 and turning the units into a leader and then get to already a couple of resources, I think is very strong. The problem I have with Han Solo is the leader's ability once again. So here we got leader's ability. You need to be playing a lot of... So in order to get the +1 attack bonus, you need the cards to have a different cost than the unit that you are attacking with, and also this cost needs to be odd, which is I mean, of course you need to play a lot of odd cards cost in the deck, which is a huge deck building constraint, not only in terms of curve but also in terms of like the amount of cards you can the kind of card you can include, especially since 2-drop is kind of the most important cost in the game. Though usually 2 cost is one of the most important things to get because you need turn 1 plays, and 1-drops don't really do as good of a job as being a turn 1 play most of the time. So it's kind of like you need to have like a substantial amount of 2 cost in your deck in order to make the deck work properly. So that's a very it's just very, very situational. So the ability is really, really terrible in my opinion. Like it's really bad. I think it might be even worse than the ability of Boba Fett. But the leader deploy is better on both, whether you talk about the leader or you talk about the upgrades. It's better. So overall, once again, very, very bad leader ability, but a leader deploy which I think is actually quite good. Will that compete with other cunning heroism leader like Han Solo, like the Han Solo, the smuggler, Audacious Smuggler? I don't think this card comes even close to Audacious Smugglers in terms of like how much of an impact it has on the game with its leader's ability. But I'm ready to give it the benefit of the doubt just because the leader deploy is very, very powerful. I think it's the kind of leader that might take some people by surprise. But I think that overall, the leader's ability being almost unplayable is a bit weird. One thing to note though with the Han Solo's ability is like you get to reveal the card of your deck and then attack. So you actually know if before you get to attack, you actually already know whether you're gonna get the +1 attack bonus or not, which is kind of a big deal. So it's nice that you get to see the card before you get to choose to attack or not. At least to what to attack, at least if you're attacking the base or attacking a unit. Next, we got Asajj Ventress. So Asajj Ventress is the third leader that's been deployed. So the 2 previous leaders were starter leaders, which are going to be in starter packs. So now they're doing starter packs slightly differently, where they're not going to be in the same box, but you can buy those 2 starter deck separately. It's definitely a move from FFG that is more customer friendly, because now if you want to, let's say there's starter card you're interested in the Han Solo deck, but then you're not interested in the Boba Fett deck, at least you can pick and choose which one you want, which is kind of nice. And the other kind of big advantage is that it makes the barrier to entry like a little bit smaller for people. People can just buy just literally one deck and start playing the game already. So it lowers the barrier to entry, and it also makes it so you can actually pick and choose. So I don't know if this will be financially beneficial for FFG to do that, but definitely from a player perspective, it is definitely a nice move. So moving on to our first rare leaders, Asajj Ventress. So another pilot leaders. I wonder if every single leaders in the set are going to be pilots. But basically, Asajj, she deals 1 damage to a friendly unit. To a friendly unit, and then you deal 1 damage to another unit in the same arena. Much more powerful leader's ability than the 2 previous leaders we talked about. The only thing I don't like about this is like the enemy unit has to be in the same arena, which is going to be a strong limitation, especially in a set where there's going to be a lot more balance between space and ground. Now, all the previous expansion, it was very ground dominated, where most of the units were ground and only a few units were space. This time around, it is definitely going to be more of a 50-50 at the very least, if not like, and that's going to make Asajj Ventress and kind of arena limited's ability a little bit weaker. So that's something I'm a bit worried about, but theoretically it's quite strong. You get a ping for free, and you also, if you're playing grit units, you also get a +1 bonus attack from the grit, which is pretty nice. Definitely a stronger leader's ability than the 2 previous one we've seen. However, it does come at the cost of having a leader deployed that is definitely weaker. The leader deploy, I guess, 4/6 grit for 6 is maybe just on the same power level as 4/7 for 6, but still fairly weak regardless you want to see about however you want to see it. And the leader deploy though is a lot weaker. We got +3/+4 for 6 instead of the +4/+4 6 that we have from Boba Fett, and also weaker than the +3/+4 for 5 that we have from Han. It still turns a unit into a leader, which is very important. It gives it grit, which is nice, and then the ability is just an on-attack ability that is not that amazing. So in my opinion, a stronger leader ability, but weaker leader deploy. I once again want to give it a maybe, because I think it's going to come down to the meta, how easy it's going to be to use that leader's ability. I think is going to be the defining factors on whether Asajj is going to see play or not, and also we're going to see how powerful the new grid cards are going to be. So far I haven't really committed to a really strong opinion, and some people might be a little bit disappointed in this. It looks like obviously not only leaders are going to be piloting, but also units can also be pilots, which I think is awesome, because I really like this mechanic, because I like having multiple ways to use my cards. So for example, with Smuggle, you can either play the card or you can smuggle them. I found that was really good. Now we're going to have either you can play the units or you can play it as a pilot. And those have different costs, which also makes it the curve a bit smoother, where you can literally have different options on how you want to play your cards. And that means that you can actually make your curve a little bit better, because now this can either be a 3-drop or a 5-drop depending on the situation. One of the main inconveniences of upgrades is that they can be quite situational. You need to really get the full value out of an upgrade. You need to kind of have the unit ready into play to be able to play that upgrade on it, and then just attack with it and just get the full value out of it. And also there's always the cases where there's always certain matchup in which upgrades can be very bad. I think upgrades are very good, for example, in the aggro matchup, it's all about racing, when you know your opponent is not going to have many removals, and upgrades can be very strong in the aggro matchup, but they're very weak against control, especially control that don't care about how big things are. So in this sense, having the option to play any card as a unit and an upgrade is inherently very powerful. So going back specifically on Chewbacca. Okay, I'm gonna have some hot takes here. I think Chewbacca is by far the best starter cards that we've seen. And it is it's my opinion, it's gonna be one of it's an extremely powerful card, and I'm gonna have a hot takes. This card is better than any Twilight of the Republic card that we've seen. Maybe with the exception of P38, but P38 is very focused on one specific deck, I guess. But like this card is already on the same power level as some of the best card of Twilight of the Republic. So let's talk about it a little bit. So we're getting a 5/6 for 5. 5/6 for 5, guys, is very good stat, first of all. I mean, obviously the best that we've seen is 6/6 for 5, but 5/6 for 5 is not far off 6/6 for 5 in the majority of the case. But on top of this, we're getting a very, very powerful ability. This unit cannot be defeated or returned to hand by enemy cards' abilities, which is very similar than the ability of TIE Phantoms, because it means that as long as Chewbacca is in play, cannot be killed with, cannot be killed by a Vanquish, cannot be killed by obviously Takedown wouldn't be able to kill him anyway, but basically Vanquish, Fel Dragon cannot kill it, like any of those, like straight up removal. You can kill it with damage, so for example Open Fire can kill it because it's just damage, and this card does not prevent damage. But it still is like very annoying, and as long as Chewbacca is in play, no Paradoxide can be used, no Paradoxide effect can be used whatsoever, which is very, very powerful. Not only that, it's because it has strong stats. Again, yes, okay, it doesn't prevent damage like TIE Phantoms can, but it makes up for that with much, much bigger stats. So now we're talking about a 5/6, so obviously much more difficult things you can do to it. Also cannot be bounced, which is very big deal as well. So strong stats and very strong ability. So already, even ignoring completely the all this part, the piloting part of the card by itself is already very good. I think this is already very playable stuff. At least would be pretty good against control at the very least. Yes, we're talking about a 5-drop that doesn't have an immediate impact on the game, but I think the stats and the ability make up for that, in my opinion. Very, very powerful ability. And the fact that it cannot be bounced once again. I mean, one of the main inconveniences of like a card that doesn't have any impact on the game is like you play a card that no immediate impact and your opponent deal with it, and then you basically spend 5 resources for nothing almost. Like it really feels very bad, and you got no value out of it. While this card, the fact that this card is so difficult to deal with mean that it's okay that if it doesn't have any immediate impact on the game, because you know that its chances of survival are really, really high. Especially if you're playing this on an empty board or on a board that is not capable of just killing the Chewbacca. So, which is something you can definitely predict. But obviously on top of all this, we're getting also the piloting ability. And this piloting ability is also very, very strong. Because we're talking about a +3/+3 for 3 upgrades, and that gives the ability that gives this unit cannot be defeated in return bind cards ability. So it basically turns something into a TIE Phantoms and gives it +3/+3. So the stat boost is completely insane, first of all. Like, we're talking about like the stat boost is just very, very significant. And this unit is going to become so much more difficult to deal with. Granted, it only works on vehicles, which is a very big limitations, but I'm also expecting that we're going to see a lot more vehicles out of this set, which is definitely going to make it a lot easier to play a vehicle-focused deck, which, by the way, there's already plenty of great payoff for this. We'll also remember, like, Prepare to Take Down, Prepare to Take Off, for example, which is just literally a card draw 2 for 2, which is great. So this card is just so good in so many levels. Not only that, it also is a Rebel, which is a super relevant trait. That means, of course, can be boosted further with a Wing Leader, can be boosted by a Fleet Lieutenant. So there's going to be a lot of very powerful thing going on. This card is so good in so many levels. So in my opinion, I'm going to give this the rating amazing. It's in my opinion, the best starter card we've ever seen. It's one of the best, it's likely to be one of the best cards in the set, in my opinion. It's very, very strong. The flexibility, of course, of being it as an upgrade or a unit is also very relevant. And once again, it's going to be an insanely powerful guard against control. And even against aggro, I think being an upgrade is going to mean that it's also going to be quite good against aggro potentially. So I think this card is really, really amazing. Moving on. We started very strong with Chewbacca. Now we're going into no disintegrations. I don't think this card is very good. And because it's basically a removal that doesn't kill anything, because it just makes the unit goes down to 1 HP. So I think granted you can combine this with a removal or just attacking a unit to finish off the unit, but that's a lot of work to kill a unit. The only context I can see this card seeing play is obviously in the context of a Vader deck. So if you play a Vader, you pay 3 for this, and then you pay an extra from Vader, you finish off the unit. So it basically turns into like a 4 damage kill anything, which is kind of cool. But there's 2 major limitations to that. The first limitation is that obviously doesn't work on anything, is that it doesn't work on leaders. So it doesn't quite kill everything for 4. And the second limitation, and I think this is probably the deal breaker for that card, is the fact that it does not kill the unit in one shot. You still require 2 actions to make this work. You have to play Nodes Aggression and then use the ping. That means the unit, whatever you want to kill, has the chance to attack you. And I think one of the main purpose of removal is not only to get rid of a unit, it's also to prevent that unit from attacking you. So, in my opinion, this is something that's very important about the back and forth nature of Star Wars Unlimited, is that you're not only trying to stabilize the ball, you're also trying to prevent stuff from having extra action. You're basically trying to deny actions from your opponent. And this is the strength of like removal. It's like not only are you getting rid of the unit, you're also preventing the unit from doing anything. And Node Disintegration doesn't have that side, because you have to kill something in 2 steps, which is a huge downside. So for all those reasons, even in a dedicated Vader deck, I don't think this card is particularly strong. It might see very niche play, depending on the meta, in Vader deck, if Vader deck ever are playable, which is far from guaranteed. So I'm not gonna, I'm gonna give it like, not a big fan of that card. I think it's just not that good. And if it ever sees plays, it's gonna be super incredibly niche. Then we got Bossk. Yet another Bossk, I would say. So 4/4/4/4. So the stat line is pretty bad. 4/4/4/4 is not a good stat line at all. The ability is not great. It basically deal 1, so it basically becomes a 5/4 on attack whenever you attack units. So it's kind of like, think about this as a 5/4 only when it attacks units. And then it taps down the unit, which is pretty much irrelevant, because most of the time you attack a unit, you want to kill it. There's going to be situations where that can be relevant, but it's very situational. So yeah, 4/4/4/4 with a relatively weak ability. But obviously it is also a pilot. The pilot comes for 2/2 for +2/+2, and the attached units exhaust the defender and deal 1 damage to it, if it's a unit. So once again, gives a very weak ability, +2/+2 for 2, which is not amazing, especially when you know that piloting only works on vehicle. So in this case, I think it's a good example of a piloting card, which I don't think is going to see competitive play, because both sides are underwhelming. Even though, of course, it's nice to have the flexibility, I think both cards are relatively underwhelming, in my opinion. So I don't think it's going to see competitive play. I could be wrong, but from my first impression, this seems to be significantly weaker than I've seen with things before. The 2 sides, once again, are fairly underwhelming, and I don't think this is going to quite make the cut. Moving on, we have Never Tell Me the Odds, which is one of those kind of like weird, kind of luck-based cards. So you need to have like a bunch of odd card discarded this way. We already talked about previously with Han that it's difficult to have a deck with a lot of odd costing card, because you need 2 drops, and 2 drops is on 2. However, if you're playing this in a Han deck, then odd cost becomes a lot easier, because suddenly using Han's ability, you can actually skip things. You don't need 2 drops, because you can go directly to 3 drops, and then you can jump from 3 drops to 5 drops, and then you can draw from 5 to 7 using Han's ability, which makes playing a lot of odd costed card in your deck a lot easier. And the same thing can be said with the other Han, the young Han, where you can jump like into curve thanks to his ability to reduce his cost reduction ability. So funnily enough, I think this card is actually better in a Han Audacious Smugglers, or in a Han on the young Han deck, because of it's much easier for the kind of deck to have a lot of odd costing card without completely screwing over your curve. With all that being said, even if you do have a deck that has a vast majority of cards in odd cost, you're talking about basically 3 damage deals like 3 plus whatever your opponent gets discarded. So it's going to be between 3 to 6 damage. The problem is like it's not guaranteed. So it's kind of like a more situational version of kind of a more random version of open fire, which is not great in my opinion. You would just rather have like just an open fire that gives you guarantee 4 damage, rather than something that on average should give you 4 damage, but sometimes it's going to give you less and sometimes gives you more. But the fact that it gives you more potentially is not really that big of a deal, because certainly not going to try to use this to try to kill large units because the odds of this actually happening are quite low. One benefit that this card does have though is that it does actually mill the opponent by 3 cards, which is not that bad. Mill 3 for 3, remember people are Vigilance in playing 6, milling 6 for 6. So the fact that it can kind of be like a mini Vigilance where it can kill something and mill you at the same time can be quite relevant. Obviously it doesn't have the flexibility of Vigilance, but it is definitely something worth noticing. So I'm gonna give this card as a maybe, just in case there's some sort of way to turn this into like some sort of Vigilance, some sort of like milling kind of archetype thing. In this case, like killing like a small unit, like something that has only 1 or 2 health, and then milling 3, not completely garbage in a melee focus deck. So I'm gonna give this a maybe. Moving on to yet another Fet Firespray. This card is kind of interesting because, so I said earlier that I found indirect damage to be a very weak mechanic, but in this case, this guy does deal a lot of indirect damage because we're talking about 2 damage when he comes into play and 2 damage when it attacks, assuming you have Boba Fett as a leader, as a unit upgrade or leader, which is obviously, so I don't, first, straight out of the bat, I don't think this card is good in a non-Boba Fett deck, but in a Boba Fett deck, I think it's a different story. So obviously Boba Fett, I think this card would have been by far the best in a Boba Fett, the classic Boba Fett from set 1, but that Boba Fett is now banned. So now the only option you have is to play this into the new Boba Fett, the red one, which does have indirect damage, which is kind of neat. So it does have some synergy with it. Obviously, I don't think this card is good enough to be played out of aspect with the Heroism Boba Fett from Shadow of the Galaxies. Yeah, if you're playing this, of course, so I think this card is it's a space unit. You could be playing like an all-space Boba Fett deck, like similar to the Jango Fetts we're seeing. I don't know if it's going to be nearly as good because one of the really Jango's ability is really relevant in this deck. While this, as I said, this indirect damage is definitely a lot less useful in my opinion. But here we're talking about a card that comes into play as a 4/4 for 4, deals 2 direct and indirect damage when it comes to play. So let's say if you combine this with ECL, even imagine like an ECL version of this where it comes into play, then it deal 4 indirect damage as well as giving you a 4/4 right of this. That can be quite powerful. Once again, I don't think indirect damage is a strong mechanic, but if you can get like a critical mass of indirect damage, it can start to become a lot more powerful. Something I forgot to mention is that the indirect damage is unpreventable in a so that means that if your opponent has, unlike for example, like we remember that TIE Phantom was a hard counter to Cad Bane, because all the damage dealt by Cad Bane could be just directed to the TIE Phantoms and be ignored and be prevented. But in the case of because the damage are unpreventable, this doesn't work anymore with TIE Phantoms. So TIE Phantoms cannot actually protect you from indirect damage, which is something worth noticing, because obviously this card is a very strong presence in the meta. So yeah, Fet Firespray, I think it's a maybe. It's gonna entirely depend on whether this new Boba Fett is going to be playable or not, and if the indirect damage archetype is going to be a thing or not. And for this, it's going to be hard to say until we get the full picture. Next, we got the new Millennium Falcon, yet another Millennium Falcons. This one is pretty sweet. First of all, 3/4 for 3 stat line is actually pretty decent for space units. This is basically as good as it gets as far as stats for a space unit, which is very neat. And we didn't have any 3/4 for 3 on the heroism side outside of the Millennium Falcon piece of junk, but the Millennium Falcon piece of junk is a little bit more different because you have to pay the cost of it, so it doesn't really count as a real 3/4 for 3 in my opinion, because it has this kind of extra string attached thing that makes it so it's kind of a not really directly comparable to other 3-drops in that sense. But yeah, this Millennium Falcon here is basically the first real 3/4 for 3 in space for heroism that we get, and that reason alone makes it potentially playable, but it had other cool thing going on for it. The other cool thing is like it's a rebel. Once again, that means wing leader, Fleet Lieutenant, Rebel Assault. 3 incredibly powerful cards can combine well with it. Potentially also Leia. We can even potentially see Leia coming back as a real leader in this set if we get enough cool, strong rebels, which so far we've seen a lot of strong rebels. So there's a lot of cool thing going on here. And then on top of all that, we get, of course, the fact that it's a vehicle, meaning that you can put your pilot on it. Means that you can search for it with pre-ordered takeoff, that kind of thing. His first ability is like now you can play an additional pilots on this. And this is kind of very situational, but I can see this like being a huge like vulture. And of course, the thing that FFG want us to do is to put Han Leader and Chewbacca on it, which would create like a massive, humongously large unit. So how does it? That +3, so it would be like 3, 6, 9. It would basically be 11 attack Falcon with like 10 health. And cannot be defeated by card effect, cannot be bounced, and is also counted as a leader. So like this unstoppable thing. This lax sounds to be pretty strong, to be fair. Obviously there's a lot that needs to happen for this, but it's kind of like a cool options to have. So the ability is anecdotal in my opinion, but it is not completely useless. So yeah, I think this card is quite good. It's quite good. I like it. I'll give you a thumbs up. It definitely gives him a thumbs up. Moving on, we got Tandem Assault, which is basically similar to Rebel Assault, and the other card is I think Outflank, the Outflank thing, which is the unconditional one. So this one is very much conditional. You need to have specifically a space unit and a ground unit into play, and the ground unit get a +2 attack. I think it's playable, but I think it's just a little bit too situational, because you really need to have a ground unit already by nature. Cards like Rebel Assault are situational because you need to have 2 ready units into play to make them work. So by nature, those cards are already situational. But this one has an additional condition of having to be specifically a space and a ground unit into play, which I think is a strong limitation. And you get the same kind of bonus +2 attack out of it. So I don't think it's unplayable, but I don't think this is going to be a card that's going to be played in the meta. I think it's just simply just too situational for an effect like that. Moving on, we got Hunting Aggressor. I actually like this card quite a bit. It has a couple of cool things going for it. First of all, it has very nice stats. So 3/6 for 4. We haven't seen any other card in the game that has a 3/6 for 4 in space. There's just none of them like this. And 3/6 is a very good stat line because that means it can kill most of the early game unit that we are usually seeing. Obviously, it's going to depend on the meta whether that's going to be a thing or not. It also has relevant trade, Underworld Transport. Transport is relevant for, I forgot the name, but there's a card that can search for transport. It's also, of course, vehicles. So that's like a lot of interesting traits. And then the ability, in my opinion, is going to be super key in indirect damage deck, because then suddenly now the indirect damage deals 1 more damage. That means that every time you trigger Boba Fett, you are effectively dealing 2 instead of 1, and suddenly the ability is becoming twice better. So very relevant ability, decent stats. That's pretty good. With all that being said, of course, the playability of this card comes down to whether or not indirect damage deck, like the Boba indirect damage deck, is going to be a thing or not. But it is already a very important piece of support. My opinion is like, if ever this deck is going to be a thing, Hunting Aggressor is definitely going to be part of it. But whether or not this card is going to be part of it or not is less than, it's not entirely sure. One thing noticing about this stat line is like it dodges Takedown and it also dodges Fail the Dragon. Really, this card is going to be relatively difficult to remove off the board, which is very nice for something that's going to have a passive ability that gets more and more value as time goes by. So I give this card a maybe because obviously it's linked to a specific archetype which we have no idea whether or not it's going to see play. And as I said earlier, by nature, indirect damage is kind of a weak mechanic, but if we have enough support for it, once again, everything is possible. Moving on, we got the Death Space Skirmisher. First thing I have to say is obviously very weak stats. A 3/3 for 3 is simply not a good stat line, even in space. especially in a world where we're going to see a 3-4-4-3 roaming all over the place. Especially with like as you do gunship, even like we could even see like interceptor becoming part of the meta. If we're going to see a lot of space units, Imperial Interceptor could come back. We already talked about as you could gunship, obviously the original Falcon, the new Falcon, just so many counters. And the wind playability is conditional. You need to have another space unit to exhaust it. So, and even if you do have that, it's still not that an amazing of an effect. So in my opinion, this card is not going to see any competitive play. It's probably going to be decent in draft, but that's going to be about it. Next, we got Zigerian Starhopper. I actually like this card quite a bit. So basically, the main thing we can compare it to is obviously Counter Spacer as kind of like 2-drop specifically for Cunning Villainy. That is the exact same stat line. Counter Spacer has a relatively conditional ability as you need to be controlling another yellow unit. And you also need to have a unit that costs 4 and less that you can exhaust. So Counter Spacer is kind of nice, but it's also kind of situational. What the advantage of Zigerian Starhopper is like it's not conditional at all. Like Holly needs to be defeated and then he deals 2 damage to indirect damage. Obviously, we already talked about their indirect damage being relatively weak, but in this case, it is 2 damage, so it is significant. And I would say that at least it does something where in a lot of situations, Counter Spacer just doesn't do anything. And the reason why Counter Spacer is seeing play is simply because it's a 2/3 for 2 in space underworld that fits quite well in the curve. So in my opinion, I'm not saying this card is definitely 100% better than Counter Spacer, but in my opinion, it has significant chances to be better than Counter Spacer. And for that reason alone, I think it's going to be playable. I still give it a maybe, but I still think this card is playable. Once again, it's not going to make a huge difference playing this over Counter Spacer in the deck that do play those cards, but I think it's going to have a little bit of an impact, I think. And that's it. We've reviewed all the cards that has been spoiled by FFG so far. Let me know in the comments below if I missed anything, which I probably did. And let me know if whatever you're looking forward to see in this expansion. Personally, I'm very, very excited. I think this new piloting mechanic is really nice. Indirect damage, I'm a bit less excited about it, but the piloting mechanic, definitely I'm excited about it. And I hope that we're going to see other new mechanics, not only those 2. But in any case, it's going to be fun. I'm also very interested to see how this is going to impact the way we build decks in terms of like space versus ground. So far, of course, decks were mostly ground-based with a little bit of space, probably something along the lines of 2/3, 1/3, or if you play a lot of removal, then you can afford to go like 3/4, 1/4, 3/4 into ground, 1/4 into space. And we only had a couple of whole space deck like that were playing like mostly in space, like for example the Jango Fett space deck being a thing in the previous sets. So kind of my thinking process about this is that if they keep right now they seem to be keeping like being space units are being understat over ground units, which I think they're always going to do because I think they're always going to do that. And what's going to happen then is going to be interesting because at the same time, if the meta becomes all space, then all space becomes a lot weaker because one of the main advantages of playing an all space deck is to basically try to ignore what your opponent is doing. So for example, a Jango Fett deck, red deck, is very strong in an environment where most other decks don't play in space, which is currently what's the case. And that's the reason why Jango Fett is so good, because you can go into space, use Jango's ability to tap down enemies on the ground and just race like that and just be very effective. If the environment start to become where there's just going to be a lot more space units, paradoxically, we're going to see a lot less space. If I hope I make sense. Like the more space deck are out there, the less powerful space deck are by definition. So I don't necessarily, even though I think that dedicated space decks are going to be a lot more powerful, I don't think we're going to end up in a meta where we're going to see all space everywhere. Because as I said, if all the other decks are also playing space, then it just completely defeats the purpose. So that's something to keep in mind. So yeah, that's kind of like a thinking process I had while looking up at this expansion. Also, another big factors for the meta is if we see those piloting leaders being a thing, we're definitely going to see people running confiscates and Fang Fighters in their sideboards and even maybe in the main deck. So that's something that is going to be worth noticing. It's going to be a strong limitation for those pilot leaders to ever become like top tier in terms of top tier in the meta. So thank you so much for following that video. If you like that kind of video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time for more videos and more exciting news about the new upcoming sets. They also talked about the collector boosters, which I'll talk about in another video. And without further ado, see you next time, and thank you for watching this.